Picture this. The year is 1988. You've just finished watching My Neighbor Totoro, a whimsical animated adventure featuring two young girls, several furry Totoro, and a flying 12-legged cat that is also a bus. Now it's time to watch the second movie in today's double billing from Studio Ghibli, Grave of the Fireflies, an animated war drama in which two young children lose their home and both of their parents, and succumb to malnutrition over several months at the end of the Second World War. Barbenheimer, eat your heart out. And while My Neighbor Totoro, while certainly not without its real inspirations, is a fictional story, the genius whimsy of director Hayao Miyazaki, Grave of the Fireflies is based heavily on real history. Director Isao Takahata's take on a short story written by Akiyuki Nosaka, based on his own childhood experiences. The film is a beautiful, fascinating examination of two young people thrown into a devastating scenario in a country on the brink of losing a war, with several real historical connections to tie it all together. So let's take a look at the real history of Grave of the Fireflies. At 7:22 a.m. on June 5, 1945, the United States Army Air Forces began its raid against Kobe, then Japan's sixth largest city and its center for ship construction. This was not its first such air raid. One in February had already damaged the city, another in March, the second worst the country ever suffered, killed more than 8,800 people and left more than 500,000 homeless, and one in May killed an additional 1,100 people. It also wouldn't be the last. But in the city of Kobe on this particular day, in this particular raid, was 14-year-old Akiyuki Nosaka, who is fictionalized in the short story and the film as the 14-year-old boy Seita, alongside his 4-year-old sister Setsuko. And just as Nosaka is represented in the story and the film, so too is the bombing on the city. More than 470 bombers hit Kobe. They were Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers, depicted faithfully in the film. With a design and production cost of more than $3 billion, there were thousands of these aircraft built in their years of operation, primarily flown by the US during World War II and the Korean War. Perhaps the two most notable B-29s were Enola Gay and Bockscar, the aircraft that carry the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Over the course of 85 minutes on June 5th, 3,006 tons of incendiary bombs and 71 tons of high explosives were dropped on Kobe. As depicted in the movie, the bombs didn't explode on impact. They were intentionally designed to activate after they landed, detonating an ignition charge that caused a fire. The city became a furnace, with the spread of fire only assisted by the strong winds. This was not an accident on the part of the United States. The city was highly congested, said to have had a population density of more than 100,000 people per square mile, and only 10% of its buildings were made from strong materials like concrete or brick. Many were built from and contained highly inflammable materials. Its water supply was also dependent on 3 large reservoirs whose supply was not particularly plentiful, certainly not for large-scale firefighting. The resulting damage, then, was perhaps inevitable. Around 4.4 square miles were devastated, making up around 28% of the built-up area. More than 51,000 buildings were destroyed, 17 buildings per ton of bombs, and the human impact was even greater. Over 3,000 people were killed and 10,000 injured, while almost 180,000 were left without homes. By the end of the war, more than 130,000 dwellings, 74% of the city's buildings, and 8.7 square miles, 51% of its total area, were destroyed. The film depicts this with devastating accuracy. One particular complex that suffered heavy damage was the factories of Kobe Steel. This is where Seita was mobilized in both the film and the short story, but he says he is unable to return because of its destruction. This certainly may have been the case for mobilized students at the time. Production at the factories almost completely collapsed after the June bombings, and only superficial repairs were made. Attendance of its 11,000 employees averaged 80% early in the year, but dropped to 60% after the March raid and 30% after the June one, never making its way back up to 50% before the end of the war. After all, more than half of the production workers had lost their homes in the raids, and there was no outside help available to assist with repairs. In fact, there was little help available to assist the city generally. The nearby city of Osaka, then Japan's second most populous city, was itself attacked only days earlier, and would be again days later, so it wasn't possible to call upon its facilities for help. Many transportation routes and systems in Kobe, already suffering after the March attacks, became virtually inoperable in June and never significantly recovered. Even bicycles were scarce. as was food. The complete stock of Kobe's emergency supplies, more than 12,000 tons of rice, were destroyed in the March and June raids, and after the latter, food distribution became completely disorganized and never came close to recovering during the war. The country had started large-scale rationing of staple foods like rice, eggs, fish, and sugar earlier in the war. In 1942, it was established that average civilians would be provided with 330 grams of rice or rice equivalents per day. On top of that, they would support themselves through gardening, trading or bartering with farmers, or eating unusual foods like boiled leaves and insects, not unlike Sator and Setsuko's diets later in the film. In the war's later years, food shortages led to rations shortages. From 1943 to 1945, a child's daily rations decreased 25%, and by 1944, the country suffered a 17% drop in average daily calories per civilian since the war began. Anecdotally, it became clear that people craved more food, including children and hard candies, as depicted by Setsuko's obsession with Sakuma drops throughout the film. These limited rations are depicted in the film too, as Sator and Setsuko are given a small amount of rice, and Sator sells some of his mother's kimono to purchase even more. In real life during the war, kimono factories closed down, and fabrics remained rationed until 1951, so assuming a buyer could be found, this wouldn't have been inaccurate. Later, Sator and Setsuko lose access to government rations after abandoning their community's administrative network, so Sator steals others' clothes and tries, but fails, to sell them too. One thing that's made clearer in the short story is that Sator is too unfamiliar with the black market to buy or sell anything. He certainly wouldn't have been the only one to consider it. In Tokyo in 1944, families relied on the black market for 9% of their rice, 38% of their fish, and 69% of their vegetables. In Osaka, the proportion of food bought on the black market rose from 18% to 24% from 1942 to 1944, though it soon dropped back again in 1945 as supply had gotten worse. There was no doubt that food had become scarce in the country by the end of the war, forcing everyday civilians to suffer, just as the young siblings do in the film. After the bombing, Sator and Setsuko head to the elementary school, where first aid stations have been set up, not unlike real life where elementary schools were used as shelters, before going to stay with their aunt in the nearby city of Nishinomiya. On their way back from a fun trip to the beach one day, the siblings witness another raid, this one over the water. This is accurate. On around 19 occasions from May to August 1945, the US dropped sea mines over the waters of Osaka Bay, deploying around 500 to 600 total mines, of which only 163 were ultimately disposed. Sator and Setsuko endure more air raids, being forced, like many others, to hide in bomb shelters, and after one raid in particular, on July 6th, when B-29s attacked and destroyed 57% of the nearby city of Akashi, the siblings decide they've had enough of their aunt's treatment and move into an abandoned bomb shelter, alone. Their independent living and subsequent lack of food rations leads Sator to steal crops from a local farmer. This wasn't uncommon. In 1944, an estimated 46% of all economic crimes committed in Osaka involved food. Sator's theft ultimately sees him facing a thankfully sympathetic police officer, who mentions there was an air raid that night on Fukui. The short story, at least in the English translation, gives the date as July 31st, but this is more likely the bombing that occurred on the night of July 19th, which saw almost 85% of the city destroyed. Unsurprisingly, more air raids occur while they live in the shelter, which gives Sator the chance to steal items while residents are hiding in their bomb shelters. The raid in which he steals the clothes that he later fails to sell is the bombing of Nishinomiya on August 5th, 1945, which destroyed 2.8 square miles, almost 30% of the city. The next day, though this isn't depicted in the film nor the story, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, the effects of which killed between 90 and 166,000 people within months. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 60 to 80,000. 6 days later, Emperor Hirohito effectively announced the country's unconditional surrender. Sator doesn't find out about his country's surrender until a week later, at which point he begins to realize that his father has died. This was to be expected. Earlier in the film, Sator says he sent a letter to his father, in care of Kure Naval Base. Likely unbeknownst to Sator, the city of Kure was bombed several times towards the end of the Pacific War. One attack in March damaged several battleships, destroyed many aircrafts, and killed at least several dozen people. Another in May saw over 500 tons of bombs destroy or damage many buildings. Another in June involved the dropping of more than 2,000 tons of bombs, destroying most of its principal shipyard. One in July saw around 40% of the city destroyed, and more towards the end of the month damaged even more aircraft and battleships. A man tells Saita that all the ships have sunk. He's not far off. By the end of the war, the Navy lost 334 warships, all but one capital ship, and more than 300,000 officers and men. Saita and Setsuko's father was once part of the crew of the Maya, a heavy cruiser, which lost 366 men when it sank in October 1944. It's not clear where he was stationed by the end of the war. After Saita discovers his country has surrendered, he buys some food to take back to Setsuko, but it's too late. According to the short story, she dies on August 22nd, 1945, succumbing to malnutrition. This wasn't entirely uncommon for the Japanese towards the end of the war. Some have argued that the situation didn't get bad enough to be a question between feast or famine, that people always managed to find food no matter how terrible it may be, all the way to the end. But that didn't stop scores from dying of starvation and malnutrition, especially among the military. Such illnesses accounted for 80% of Japanese military deaths in the Philippines and 50% of those in China. Some believed the country was on the brink of a more devastating mass starvation had it not been for its surrender. After Setsuko's death from malnutrition, Saita too ends up malnourished, starving on the floor of a Sanomiya train station. Passers-by complain, calling him filthy, disgusting, disgraceful. One complains that they don't want Americans to see this. They're referring to Operation Blacklist, the US occupation of Japan after the end of the war, of which Kobe was part of Phase 1. The American military was dispatched to each prefecture in the country in September and October to ensure the occupation policies were followed, with the goal of having a peaceful, prosperous and democratic nation that would respect the rights of other states in accordance with the United Nations. By late 1945, there were around 430,000 American soldiers stationed in the country, but Saita would not live to see the country's occupation. Almost exactly 1 month after Setsuko's death, on September 21st, Saita too died, his sister's name the last utterance he ever makes. Setsuko. Takahata's animated film is a beautifully faithful retelling of Nosaka's short story, itself strongly inspired by Nosaka's real experiences at the end of the war. And there are several parts of the story that are heartbreakingly similar to Nosaka's real life. But as became clearer later in his life, there are several differences too. Nosaka was really in Kobe on June 5th, 1945, during the devastating air raid. He really did run away from his home after the bomb started to fall, but it seems he did so alone. He sat at a hillside bomb shelter with a young 4 or 5-year-old girl where they could see the destruction of Kobe, but though this girl inspired the character of Setsuko, it was not his sister. His foster mother had taken his younger sister, 16-month-old Keiko, into the family bomb shelter to protect her, and when the bombs came down and the fire spread, she had carried Keiko into the burning building and suffered severe burns in doing so. Like in the story and film, she was taken to a nearby elementary school covered in bandages, but unlike in the story and film, she survived. In fact, she lived until the 1970s. Nosaka's mother was transferred to a seaside hospital in Nishinomiya, and her mother came to look after her, at which point Nosaka and his sister moved in with relatives nearby. He located a container of provisions that his foster father had buried in their garden, but once that was exhausted, he and Keiko resorted to stolen food, small rations of rice, and other things he could forage like freshwater snails. Keiko began to suffer from undernourishment, having been too young to chew hard foods, and often having her share taken by her brother. Whenever Nosaka heard the raid siren, he strapped Keiko to his back and ran to a bomb shelter dug into a hill near a pond. In early July, he made the decision to move to the bomb shelter with his sister, citing incidents with his relatives and feeling shunned by his neighbors. However, unlike the story we're familiar with, Nosaka and Keiko didn't remain at the shelter. In early August, they evacuated to an acquaintance's house in Fukui Prefecture, but Keiko's condition had deteriorated at the shelter and only became worse. She reverted from walking to crawling, became too weak to cry or eat, and eventually would just endlessly sleep until she died of malnutrition on August 21st, 1945. Nosaka was away at the public bath when his sister died. He got a death certificate and cremated Keiko's body and collected her remains in a small medicine tin before rejoining his mother and grandmother in Osaka. When others asked about what happened to his sister, he said that she had died in an air raid. It's clear from the story alone that Nosaka felt immense guilt for the death of his sister, and to that end, Grave of the Fireflies is not his attempt to rewrite the past or to protect his image, but to honor and apologize to his sister. Seita is not a perfect or accurate representation of Nosaka. In many ways, he is who he wished he had been. He wished he could have cared for his sister, like Seita had cared for his. Where Seita saved Setsuko, Nosaka felt he had abandoned Keiko. Where Seita rocked his sister to calm her in her sleep, Nosaka had struck his to silence her. Where Seita had provided food, Nosaka had taken an extra share. He found himself too preoccupied with self-preservation to fully realize his love and affection for her, until, not unlike the story, it was too late. Perhaps the most notable difference between the story and reality is that while Seita died, Nosaka did not. Unlike Seita, he found he had the resources to avoid such an outcome. In November 1947, after being caught stealing, Nosaka was kept in an overcrowded juvenile prison where he witnessed boys like Seita dying of malnutrition and untreated diseases. Nearing his 4th week of confinement, he realized he would die, so he contacted his biological father, a wealthy politician, and was released. It wasn't until years later that he felt he had abandoned his former cellmates by having his father come and rescue him. It seems it's no accident then that Seita died the way he did. As David C. Stahl expertly put it, through Seita, Nosaka was able to symbolically reenact the past in such a way as to put himself through the degrading, grotesque forms of death and dying that he had witnessed in others. This becomes clearer over the course of the short story, as the line between third person and first person becomes blurred. The story's hero and its storyteller merged into one being. Grave of the Fireflies is intrinsically linked to the story of Akiyuki Nosaka. To this end, it seems the production of the animated film helped Nosaka come to terms with what had happened, allowing him to begin to confront his past. He once admitted that simply watching the opening scenes kept him crying all night. It took the medium of animation to convince Nosaka that a film adaptation of his story was possible, and perhaps no director was more suited for the role than Isao Takahata. On June 29, 1945, 3.5 weeks after the bombing of Kobe, 9-year-old Takahata was in the city of Okayama when more than 60% of it was destroyed. Awoken by the bombs, he and his sister panicked, running towards the blazing city. He helped tend to her after a blast injured her, and she later credited her brother for saving her life. Years later, Takahata still considered this experience the worst of his life. 40 years later, he undoubtedly revisited these memories in crafting Grave of the Fireflies, just as Nosaka had done 20 years earlier when writing the short story. As Alex de Dr. Witt put it, Grave of the Fireflies is an unusually personal adaptation of a remarkably intimate text. The memories and philosophies of its two authors are entwined, sometimes inextricably, in its simple story. In 2014, almost 70 years after the end of the war, about a year before he died, Nosaka continued to be occupied by its events. "I'm still unable to leave the burnt-out ruins," he confessed. Now, 57 years after the publication of his short story, 36 years after the release of the animated film, we are still unable to leave this story in ruins, and we ought to strive to never leave behind the real history and the true events that inspired it.